Good morning. Good morning. It is Thursday, March 22nd. Hard to believe March is already almost to a close. This year is absolutely blazing by. And I swear this has been the slowest week of my life. Not having your car is not a whole lot of fun. I mentioned on one of my previous programs that my car died on Sunday. And everything's going to be okay. I'm just waiting to get it back now. And I swear, it's the longest wait in my entire life. I'm awfully attached to my car, but that's a story for another day. You're not listening to hear about Adam's personal life. You're here to get a little political insight. And there's a couple of things I want to touch on before I get into the core of today's program. And if you've been watching the news or listening to any other talk radio programs, you probably heard this already, but it doesn't hurt to go over it one more time. It's interesting to see that Secretary of Energy, Stephen Chu, decides to give himself an A- when it comes to his personal grade of himself when it comes to energy policy, when gas has doubled in the last 3 years. This from hotair.com. The report from the Department of Energy is starting to look pretty darn good. 3 weeks ago, Energy Secretary Stephen Chu gave himself an A- for his stewardship of taxpayer money, and shortly afterward, the government's Accountability Office gave the Department of Energy an 85% fail rate in handling the loan guarantee program. Chu came back to Capitol Hill today to discuss energy policy and stood by his self-assigned A- and gave himself an even better grade on controlling gas prices. If you can believe that. Energy Secretary Stephen Chu told a House panel on Tuesday that he'd give himself top marks when asked to grade his policy's effects on energy prices. Representative Darrell Issa, the chairman of the House Committee on Oversight and Government Reform, asked President Obama's top energy official if he'd grade himself with an A- on controlling the cost of gasoline at the pump, quote. Chu responded by saying that he'd give himself a better grade than that. Chu said, "The tools we have at our disposal are limited, but I would say I would give myself a little higher in that since I became Secretary of Energy. I've been doing everything I can to get long-term solutions," Chu said. Talk about grade inflation. ABC News reported last night that the gas prices have hit an all-time high for the month of March, although ABC claims that it may have peaked. The average price of a gallon of regular is now $3.87, the highest ever recorded in the month of March. The average price is up nearly 4 cents from a week ago, and I think yesterday here locally it jumped 10 cents from day to day, just about. And over 30 cents from a year ago. 30 cents in a year, according to the Department of Energy, as more drivers face gas prices of $4 a gallon for more across the country. Last week, an average gas price was $3.83 a gallon, the previous record, according to data going back to 1990. It's just wild, and there's this very, very easy-to-use website. It's called toomutchattthepump.com. And you can punch in the make, model of your car, how large your gas tank is, or how large your gas tank is, actually, and see how much it costs to fill up your car. Well, when President Obama took office, gasoline was $1.85 a gallon. It's now $2 more than that at the average. It's $3.87. Just shy of, actually just more than double. Back in January of 2009, I could fill up my Honda Civic for $24.42. Now at $3.87 average, that's about $3.70 or so here, I believe. It's $51 a gallon. This is just taking the national average of gas. There's a number of reasons that it takes a different price at different parts of the country. So let's take a look at, let's say you drive what's a pretty common car? We'll do a Chevrolet Impala. Let's see how much it costs to fill up that thing. Okay, it costs $31 to fill up your Chevrolet Impala 3 years ago. It now costs more than double that at $65 a gallon. Don't they make the Tahoe still? Here we go. Here's a Tahoe 1500. That's a big truck, right? All right. When President Obama took office and you drove a Chevrolet Tahoe, it cost $48 to fill up. You're now paying over a $100 bill to fill up your Chevrolet Tahoe now. I harp on this all the time about the unseen in the economy. I know the president does not directly control gas prices, but he sure has a lot to do with it. The moratorium on oil drilling in the Gulf certainly doesn't make him look good in that regard. Not signing the Keystone Pipeline, drilling on federal land, being down 40%, does not look good, even though there's a massive production increase in North Dakota. You know the unemployment rate in North Dakota is 3.5%? That is overemployment, according to most economists. We talk about unemployment or underemployment all the time. It's not often you hear about overemployment, and North Dakota is one of those places where there is overemployment. Well, there in Washington, D.C., I would say, we have a lot of overemployment. But just think about, in the last 3 years, how much gas has cost you otherwise. What is the opportunity cost of spending that much extra on gasoline? What else could you have spent that money on? It starts to become very, very personal when you have people that play with your wallet like that. If the president is accountable for any portion of the change in gas, we could be fair and say he might only be 50 cents of that increase, of the $2 some odd increase. But 50 cents is a lot over time. Anyway, we talk all the time about, Stephen Chu does anyway, talks about European gas prices and how he'd like us to pay as much as the Europeans do. Well, what is the EU and their economic policies when it comes to energy, transportation, things like that? What has that done for the EU? Well, let's take a historical look back at the EU. Now, the world economy was doing very well, at least on paper, after World War II. In the decade from 1951 to 1960, the EU decade average gross domestic product growth was 5%. In 1961 to 1970, it went down to 4% for that decade average. The next decade, 1971 to 1980, it was 2.75%. During the 1980s, it actually staved off a little bit. It didn't fall so sharply. It stayed at about 2.5%. And about the same for the 1990s, about 2.3% during the 1990s. And the most recent decade, economic performance in the EU has been just above 1% average growth. Now, the EU hasn't been around since the 1950s, but we take the same countries that have been around since the 1950s and put them all together. And the EU has had the economic community, the European the Coal Workers Union. The EU has taken many different shapes, but it's all been very much the same thing. It's been an economic coordination on many levels. And European politicians love to talk about the huge benefits of membership in the EU. And while I think it's true, the concept of a single market between EU member states has brought tangible benefits, but those have certainly been declining, in importance at least, as technological change has made access to services and capital cheaper and easier. Trade liberalization progressed worldwide, in spite of the EU's efforts to liberalize trade in their own region. Moreover, the Brussels-based EU bureaucracy has expanded, and economic liberalization gave way to regulation instead that helped to strangle economic growth in Europe, as I've already shown for you. Consider the latest absurdity to emerge from the EU. Talk about a poultry regulation, for example, which aimed to increase the comfort of egg-laying chickens, but resulted in a drastic cut in egg production and a 100% increase in the price of eggs. The price of eggs doubled after a poultry regulation aimed to increase the comfort of egg-laying chickens. This is what you have to look forward to, ladies and gentlemen, if we go down this path. We have laws that are aimed to increase the comfort of egg-laying chickens. And the EU certainly does not appreciate the problem of unintended consequences because they have the best intentions in the entire world. Isn't the road to hell paved with good intentions? I think that's how the saying goes. So be careful what good intentions you have, especially if you're going to promote those good intentions at the cost or at the expense of others. A record number of citizens don't trust the EU, 63%. The EU Parliament, 70% of the European population does not trust the EU. If the EU elite persist in killing jobs and growth, and doing a poor job at settling these countries that have ridiculous levels of debt, it may bring about the ultimate unintended consequence of the EU, which would be the breakup of the EU, which I don't see. Financial collapse may do it, but financial collapse is not a guarantee. Anyway, we'll be back after the break. We'll talk about our own budget issues here in the United States. Adam Uglum here. Be right back. And we are back. The telephone number, 678-601-8255. Again, the telephone number, 678-601-8255. If you'd like to call in and be part of the program, that's 678-601-TALK. And coming back from the break, like I said, I was going to get back into talking about our side of the pond after talking about the EU just a little bit and talking about our own issues and how similar they are. Now, I was doing a lot of reading. For some reason, Paul Ryan is back in the spotlight. I think it's because he's reproposed a budget for the Congress. My goodness, how dare we propose a budget? The Senate hasn't passed one in, I believe, over 1,100 days. It's been a while since I'd last looked at the numbers, but we're going on 3 years here where the Senate has not passed a budget. The Democratic Senate has not passed a budget. The president's own budget failed earlier last year, 97-0. Not one Democrat voted for President Obama's budget. Congress has been operating without a budget for a long time, and the House can't pass one that passes in the Senate at least. I think the Republicans in the House have passed several budgets. None have passed in the Senate. Interesting times we live in. Interesting times indeed. So anyway, I've been doing a lot of reading back and forth, criticism and praise for Paul Ryan's budget plan. Mostly from libertarian scholars. Some say it's fantastic, others say it's not so good. So I think it's kind of an interesting approach to looking at the budget. The plan will likely pass the House, but it won't become law this year. That's a guarantee, but it will get plenty of publication, though, that's for sure. However, the plan does signal the direction that House Republicans want to go in budget battles with the Democrats this year, and it also shows the likely thrust of policy under a possible Republican president next year if we don't get a Republican Senate as well. The Democrats are very vulnerable in the Senate this year. I believe of the 33 seats that are up this year in the Senate, 2/3 of those are Democrats, and I think 9 or 10, something like that, are Republicans. So it's going to be very interesting to see what happens with the Senate and the House. I don't think Democrats are going to pick back up the House. It'll be interesting to see if they hang on to the Senate. And if Obama gets reelected and we have a Republican House and Senate, it will be very interesting to see what happens these next 4 years. Anyway, so here's a few highlights of Paul Ryan's budget plan. Total federal outlays would fall from $3.6 trillion this year to $3.5 trillion next year. These figures are $24 billion less than under President Obama's budget this year and $187 billion next year. Talk about draconian cuts, going from $3.6 trillion to $3.5. That is a draconian cut if I ever saw one. Of the $187 billion savings compared to Obama next year, $38 billion would come from discretionary programs, $146 billion from so-called entitlements, and $3 billion from interest costs. Ryan's proposed spending in 2022 of $4.8 trillion, just about $4.9 trillion, would be a modest 13% less than Obama's proposed spending that year. Now, that's a useful statistic to remember when you read the inevitable stories about how Ryan would slash, burn, and pillage the government safety net. Indeed, Ryan's proposed increase of federal spending from $3.6 trillion this year to nearly $4.9 trillion by 2022 represents fairly robust annual average growth of 3%. As a share of gross domestic product, the Ryan budget would trim outlays from 23.4% this year to 19.8% by 2022. It's 10 years to cut the growth of government to take us from 23.4% to 19.8%. Now, I've talked before on my radio show about Hauser's Law, and it takes the top marginal tax bracket, as the left always likes to talk about, the top marginal tax rate, and how important it is for revenues in this country, and how we cannot cut taxes on the wealthy, or I guess anyone for that matter. Tax revenue since we've had an income tax, has always been right around 19 or 20% of gross domestic product, period. It's never mattered what the rate is, doesn't matter how many people are paying. Tax revenues have always been about 19%. Now, in a big recession like this one, they fall to about 16, but the average over time is 19%. The only two times it's ever been over 20 or 21% was right after World War II and during the 1990s, with tremendous, unparalleled economic growth. So what that tells us is that the tax rate is not nearly as important as gross domestic product, regardless of whatever else you think about Hauser's law. The fact is that tax revenue as a percentage of GDP is indicative that it is far more closely tied to economic growth than anything else. The question then is how we promote economic growth. Do we tax and spend and invest on what we think is desirable for the economy, or do we leave the money in the economy and let the economy do its job? Depends on the lens you're looking through. The reduction from 23.4%, which is the current level of spending, that reduction would simply get spending back to around the normal historical level, as I just mentioned. And note that spending would still be higher than the 18.2% achieved in the last 2 years under President Clinton. Now, isn't that funny? We had budget surpluses under President Clinton with a Republican Congress when we had record low levels of spending, not record high levels of taxes. Isn't that weird? That's so weird. I thought taxes were the answer to reducing deficits. Ryan would repeal the 2010 healthcare law and reform Medicare by transitioning to a consumer choice model. Those changes are expected to reduce annual outlays by 2022 by $258 billion. Perhaps a more important proposal is the block granting of Medicaid and other entitlement programs such as food stamps. Those reforms would save us $313 billion annually by 2022. Converting entitlements to block grants would allow the federal government to clamp down on federal costs while giving the states strong incentives to improve program efficiency. Imagine that, because states can't borrow money like it's coming out of thin air or growing on trees. So when you block grant what you're already spending and just cap the spending there, let the states take care of the rest. They can tax, just like you can, Mr. Government, but they don't have the borrowing capability that you do, so they're going to be a lot more honest about it. The Ryan budget does not propose Social Security reform. Paul Ryan favors major reforms to this program, but he apparently thinks that reforming healthcare and other entitlements is a higher priority right now. Aside from a few obvious targets such as high-speed rail and 2010 healthcare law, the Ryan budget shies away from abolishing specific programs, agencies, and departments. Too often, the Ryan budget proposes to fix broken programs when the proper reform would be elimination. Ryan proposes to consolidate federal job training programs, for example, but these programs have a history of failure, is the big problem there. So while it may save money, they should really be eliminated altogether. Well, the big question then is whether or not that's politically feasible. In sum, Ryan's proposals are very modest. What we are left with Ryan's budget plan is still an awfully big government. But that's not how it's going to be portrayed in the media. I think what Ryan's doing is being very, very politically charged. The plan he's proposing is political genius. But the media is not going to let it be played out as political genius, because when looking at just the numbers and figures, Democrats should sign on, but it's campaign season. Back after the break. Good morning, News Talk 1330 WLBB, back with about 7 minutes left in the program, talking about Paul Ryan's budget plan as it's now a hot piece in the national media. And I'm telling you, don't believe what they say about the Ryan budget plan or what they say about it in the national media, because it's still big government. It's just a modest proposal to fix our short-term problems in the next decade. Or fix our long-term problems, I suppose, in the short term over the next decade. It's going to be very complicated to try and do that. It won't pass this year. I mean, Democrats and the left are going to squeal that Paul Ryan's budget proposal is a massive threat to the poor, the sick, and the elderly. It is less than a 1% cut to anything. Just thinking about it from a very basic perspective, how much harder would life really be if we took a penny of every dollar that the federal government spends? I don't think that is a whole lot to ask for, to be perfectly honest. Let's just go through the entire federal outlays this year. We'll take a penny from every dollar spent, a 1% reduction in absolutely everything. I don't care what it is. A 1 penny reduction in absolutely everything. The idea of moving these programs to a block grant from the federal government down to the states is a big step in the right direction. There's a lot of kind of happy talk from the conservatives about how we should make these big government programs more effective and better somehow. More cost effective, more efficient, when really they should be done away altogether, if you ask me. Now, I know I'm quite radical, but I think we should abolish Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security at the federal level. I'd be a lot more okay. I still wouldn't be okay with them at the state level, but I would be a lot more okay with them at the state level because they would be ran a whole lot better. Feel free to disagree with me on that. But there are a lot of issues that are not federal issues. We have a federal government and we have state governments. There is absolutely no reason that states could not handle a large portion of what the federal government does. The federal government, our national government, needs to handle national issues like an army and making sure states don't fight each other. That's what we're supposed to be like in the United States. Anyway, so regardless of the extremely modest proposals in the budget proposal by Representative Paul Ryan, the left is going to scream bloody murder when it comes to these draconian cuts of less than 1% across the entire budget. Paul Ryan's biggest thing is proposing that seniors actually control their health care. Instead of the government writing a check to wherever you'd like it to go, you get a voucher and you buy your own insurance policy. What a novel idea. If you're a pretty healthy senior and don't need some fancy plan, you can buy a cheaper plan, which you can kind of do now, but it's a novel idea in the very least. This baloney that it's an attack on women, the poor. I don't get it. It's excessive rhetoric that's employed by the left to criticize lower spending levels for domestic welfare programs. It's not much different than the excessive rhetoric that Ryan uses to argue against sequestration-induced reductions in military spending. For instance, Paul Ryan even speaks of the devastation to America's national security that sequestration would allegedly cause. At the outset of Ryan's introduction to his plan, he quotes James Madison and says that the founders designed a constitution of enumerated powers, giving the federal government broad authority over only those matters that must have a single national response, while sharply restricting its authority to intrude on those spheres of activity better left to the states and the people. Well, it sounds awfully nice, and as much as I like James Madison, then Ryan goes to make statements like this. But when government mismanagement and political cowardice turn this element of the social contract into an empty promise, seniors are threatened with denied access to care, and the next generation is threatened with a debt that destroys its hard-earned prosperity. Both consequences would violate President Lyndon B. Johnson's pledge upon signing the Medicare law. No longer will older Americans be denied the healing miracle of modern medicine. No longer will young families see their own incomes and their own hopes eaten away simply because they are carrying out their deep moral obligations to their parents and to their uncles and their aunts. To fulfill Johnson's pledge in the 21st century, America's generations-old health and retirement security programs must be saved and strengthened. Social contract? So much for those enumerated limits on federal power. Ryan's statement of constitutional and legal authority only cites Congress's general power to tax and spend. based on the contents of his proposal, which would do little to rein in the federal government's scope, as I mentioned earlier. The problem is that even under Ryan's plan, the federal government is still able to continue spending money on pretty much any activity that it wants. And here is the problem we face, is that the status quo is so strong, even a extremely modest and to me, not enough proposal like Ryan's is going to be portrayed as this nightmarish scenario where the hegemon in Washington is going to be overthrown. You heard the numbers, folks. It's a very, very modest decrease over the next 10 years. It's a $100 billion increase next year. Less than 1%. Just think about it. Here's my proposal. Let's just take 1 penny of every dollar of every spending period at the federal level and see what happens.